Good morning. My name is Mike Clarkin, and I welcome all of you at the World Agility Forum to this panel, which is the future of management. I'm incredibly excited to moderate today a really interesting, compelling panel of experts to talk to you about what we could imagine the way management might be in the future and how that might really enable a better way of work in our organizations, in our governments, in our operations, in our public lives, what have you. So I'm going to let the team introduce themselves. But we have today Steve Denning, Kurt Carlson, David Kirkpatrick, and Raymond Hoffman. So Steve, maybe you can start us off. A quick introduction and kind of what's your background here and how does it relate to leadership change in the future of management?
Well, I worked in the World Bank for several decades. I taught leadership for a decade, and the last decade I've been writing and working in management, agile management, and what it means for the future of management.
Thanks very much, and we really enjoyed your kickoff this morning, your keynote. I think we'll get to elaborate a little bit today on some of those thoughts. Kurt, maybe you could share with us your background and introduce yourself as well.
Yes, thanks, Mike. I worked for RCA for many years, then GE. Then I became part of SRI International. SRI is in Silicon Valley. It's a very famous place. When I went there, it had been failing for 20 years. It was basically bankrupt. Everybody hated each other. It actually did Steve's 3 rules of customer focus, small teams, and networks, but they were just not the right ones. So that's kind of an interesting story of what we had to add to make that work. But the bottom line was that with no money and being with buildings falling down all around me, we turned the place around. I grew SRI 3.5 times, got to be about a $600 million business, and in the process created a family of multi-billion-dollar innovations such as Nuance Communication, the leading speech company. Intuitive Surgical is a $60 billion robotic surgery company. High-definition television set the U.S. standard, won an Emmy for that. And then the last thing when I was there was Siri. That was bought personally by Steve Jobs, and that was about $50 billion to Apple. When I retired, I now teach at Northeastern University and WPI on innovation and value creation.
Thanks, Kurt. That sounds like a really interesting story. We'll dig more into SRI as we go here, I think, today. Fascinating background. Doug, why don't you join the conversation? Let us know about your work.
Yeah, I'm Doug Kirkpatrick. I've been an edge dweller for about 30 years as part of the core startup team of a company called Morningstar. We grew that company from zero to a near $1 billion company with thousands of employees based on simple principles of organizational self-management, agency, autonomy, and freedom. Pretty sure everyone in North America has eaten our product, and probably most people in Europe as well. Now I'm a TEDx speaker, a Forbes speaker, an author of the No Limits Enterprise, and I consult and share the message of organizational self-management all across the USA and all around the world.
Thanks, Doug. That sounds like a really interesting, different than kind of high-tech Silicon Valley, but I think it's interesting to see how these practices span multiple industries and multiple ways of working companies. So great to have you participate today. Raymond, let's hear from you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Raymond Hoffman. I'm an independent advisor. I'm based in Switzerland. I basically work with executive teams in companies of all sizes, globally, not just limited to Switzerland. Basically, I work with them on improving their management models. It is to make them fit for the 21st century and turn management into a source of what I like to call competitive advantage. I'm not a follower of a particular school, so I'm not, agile or self-management or teal or whatever you might call it. I'm just a lifelong student of management, and I'm interested in anything that works based on evidence and reason. My background really is in IT. I started my first career as a software developer, and through a few detours, I ended up as a C-level executive, helping a Swiss company going from startup to global market leader in banking software. And it was in that job really that I also discovered my true passion, which is really management as a means to improve work and make organizations better. So that was about 15 years ago when I quit and set up my own consulting practice to do exactly that. And I'm still doing this. And when I'm not working with a client, I'm right now working on one of my pet projects, which is developing a process and a tool set to help us design and test management models. Something we take for granted, in the world of business models and value propositions to some extent, but where we're still miles away in terms of management. So it's an honor to be here, particularly in such a illustrious company, and I look very much forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Raymond. Well, I think this is going to be a great discussion. And you kind of pointed it out, management models, what's the past, what's the future? I'm going to ask each one of you, we're in an interesting moment in time, it seems like. This has been the last 6 months have brought a lot of crisis, has brought a lot of pressure, it's brought a lot of new thinking, it's brought a lot of new urgency. And people are starting to question the way we have been doing things in all parts of the business. One in particular is what's the model or the role of leadership in a company these days. So, maybe I'll start with Kurt just to kick it off, if that's all right. Didn't mean to catch you by surprise, Kurt, but start us off. What in your perception, what's the role of executive leadership or leadership management in a company in the 21st century? Where are we going here?
So I mentioned that when I went to SRI, it was completely broken, and we had to turn it around. And we had a few principles. The first is the purpose of an enterprise is to sustainably create and deliver customer value. Sustainably. That's the key word that's often forgotten. The second thing was, how do we make those results inevitable? So oftentimes we hear, do this, do that, but the end result is not inevitable. And our key insight into how to make it inevitable is to realize that innovation is a learning science. Our insight was then, well, once you understand that, what are the best ways to learn? So I've written a Harvard Business Review article on this. It will be out shortly. But at SRI, my job was, I was the champion kind of our value creation process. It was what was missing at SRI previously. I mean, it was a customer-focused organization, but we just weren't focusing on the right things. So how do we do that? It did form small teams, but they weren't the right teams. They were the wrong teams. The third thing is, how do you put together networks? Well, it has to be the right network so you can solve big, important problems and make the whole thing work. What was missing was a structure based on best learning principles to make those results inevitable. And I was convinced that that was my job. It was to make sure that was in place. And obviously, I had lots of other jobs. And it included a lot of the things that Steve and others talk about in terms of pushing the decisions down, finding champions.
Appears we've frozen with Kurt. Is that my experience or just everybody else's too?
No, it's frozen.
No, I see him frozen too.
So, Doug, why don't you add to that? I think, well, Kurt will come back here, I'm sure. This is
people came together.
He's back.
We added certain things like frameworks. The most important framework to us is the definition of the value proposition. If you walk into most companies and you ask the executives to write on a board their definitions for customer value, innovation, and a value proposition, they don't have it. It's the most basic stuff in the world that's not taught. And until you put those fundamental principles in place, you're not going to get inevitably the results you want. So I think, when I think about the innovation practices around the world, just the last point I'll make here is that most of the performance is pretty awful. We've done workshops with 500 teams around the world. There isn't one team that's ever been able to describe the value proposition for what they're doing the first time. Not one. Not one. And usually about 3/4 of what they're working on goes away. It has no value. And it's because, again, they don't define the principles. There are three things I'll come back to. Important problems, or else you can't make an impact. Shared language, including the value proposition, or you can't collaborate efficiently and focus on the customer. It's all about delivering value to the customer. And the third thing is, how do you learn fast enough to be systematically successful? And we call those value creation forums. So my job was to make that happen, and that's what turned SRI around.
It's great, Kurt. That's a really powerful set of pillars to that model. I can see you nodding your head. Talk to us about how that it sort of aligns with your experiences and what you see the role of leadership and management is in this coming decade or decades.
I think that the evolution of the C-suite requires that leaders cultivate multiple intelligences. So we think of cognitive intelligence, but that's one of 8 or 9 types. So leaders need to develop interpersonal, empathy, intrapersonal, spatial, and all the other types of intelligences in order to scan the environment, identify threats, risks, opportunities, all the rest, and then create meaning so they can share and communicate that meaning with people inside the organization. And part of that has to do with giving people agency and autonomy and freedom to do their best work. Marcus Buckingham wrote a book last year called 9 Lies About Work. And he said that one of the lies is that leadership is a thing. So in the old days, a couple decades ago, we had leadership models, and a consultant would parachute into an organization and give an assessment and 360 of some kind, and then roll out the model. And it could be a 5-part, 7-part, 12-part model, and kind of show people where they suck at leadership. And then they would try to motivate people with inspiring videos of Martin Luther King Jr. and other great leaders of history. And people would just feel like depressed. Well, the solution is we'll do a year or 2 of coaching and, fill in the gaps and fix the things that need to be fixed. Well, leadership is actually probably much simpler than that. And if we look to great philosophers like Peter Kessenbaum, he's got a fabulous idea of leadership is managing free will and polarity. And it has to do with having courage to stand alone, take unpopular stands, defend people who are not in the room, take positions that no one else wants to take, and balancing that with the polarity of reality and understanding that reality involves constraints as well as opportunities, and understanding that we also need to balance with ethics, and ethics is about other people. So courage is about yourself, ethics is about empathy, but it's also about principle and always doing the right thing. And then balancing reality with vision of a desired future state into which you can invite people to follow you on a journey. And to the extent that we can optimize courage, ethics, reality, and vision, we can all become great leaders. We can create organizations full of leaders, and that's the great competitive strategic advantage of self-managed organizations.
I like that last comment about everybody being a leader. I think it's really interesting. Steve, Kurt talks a bit about kind of focusing on the right things and making sure you understand what the definition of value is. You very much described as kind of managing the human dynamic and enabling all kinds of leadership across the organization. Raymond, how does that fit with the kinds of successful leaders you've seen and what you think those roles start to indicate for us?
Well, I think, first of all, the role, the way you asked the question, what's the role of leaders and executives today, really? I think it's the same it always was, right? Peter Drucker taught us that, the role of management is to make organizations function. That means to enable people of joint performance, just to come together and together achieve things that no one could do on their own. And I think that hasn't changed. So I think that's where the focus really has to be in terms of what this means, is that the most important part of a leader, of an executive, has to be to understand how work works and make it better. And I think that's what Kurt also related to in terms of making things inevitable, right? So you have to understand how work works and then make it better so that the right outcomes actually do become inevitable. And obviously you have to do that at every level of the organization. And that brings me to Doug's comments about, really everybody, being a leader, and seeing that as part of their role. But then the next, and for me, the much more interesting question really is, how do managers actually do that? Right? And that means you have to clarify your management model. place. How does the work of management actually get done, right? So in essence, if you want to boil this down, for me, this means, your management model has to answer 5 questions. First is, how does your organization today create value and execute its current business model? 2, how does it innovate future business models, products, and services? 3, how does it build bridges between the two, between current execution and sort of the innovation piece of the enterprise? 4, how does it change, learn, and improve over time? And 5, how does it enable people to perform at their highest levels, both as individuals and as teams? Now, obviously, managers try to do that. We try to do that by putting in place all sorts of practices and processes and tools and so on and so forth across a wide range of management disciplines. And all of these choices that we make in terms of practices and processes, are all heavily influenced and driven by some underlying thinking, call it principles, call it worldview, call it management theory, however you want to call it. And if you choose well, what you actually get is kind of a coherent picture of things actually fitting together so that actually the outcomes you want become inevitable. Right? But here's the thing. Whenever I talk, and I just had to laugh, when Kurt said, he hasn't met the team who could explain their value proposition. I haven't met the management team who could explain their management model. They simply have no idea how they do their work of management. They don't know how management works. They can't tell you why they choose this practice over that practice. They don't even know explicitly what kind of theory they're following or what kind of principles they're following, making all those decisions and whether those are helpful or not. They simply don't know. In other words, they don't know how their own work works. So how should they know how the work of the organization works? How to make the company better, the department better. So they're really in a difficult situation there. And really, I like how, and I'll end with that, how Jason Fried, the founder and CEO of Basecamp, puts it. It's like, your company better be your best product because it's the product you use to make everything else you do. And that's really the choice. For me, that's really the role and the job of management, to make your company your best product.
It's a great way to sum it up, Raymond. I appreciate that. Stephen, leadership and management, and how does that apply to making your company your best product? What would you add to this so far, and what are the other pieces we need to consider?
Well, I would start by saying that leadership is mainly BS. That's the title of Jeff Pfeffer's wonderful book, Leadership BS, and he goes on to document the leadership industrial industry wastes $20 billion a year trying to create executive leaders to no apparent effect. You can read Barbara Kellerman, professor of leadership at Harvard, has come to the same conclusion. So how did we get into a situation where everyone is talking about leadership? It started in the 1980s when people saw that management was doing a bad job, the reasons that I laid out in my talk. And they said, well, the solution is we're going to have leaders. Leaders will get us out of this mess. And if you think about the mess that I described earlier in my talk and the array of problems from goal, structure of work, the dynamic, innovation, strategy, budget, HR, a stack of problems, the idea that a leader is somehow going to come into this world and magically solve those problems. What I think Raymond, I would agree with, is we need people who can get things done. And the glorification of leadership and the disparagement of management has been part of the catastrophe that I described in my talk earlier.
So if everybody aspires to be able to get stuff done, and we're saying that this role of management is more kind of everyman as opposed to single individual, what are we asking people to get into here? What's the benefit for me? How should I be different? Maybe I'll work my way. I'm looking across my screen saying, let's do the lottery. Doug, what should people be expecting to do different? What's in it for me? Why should I want to change?
Number of reasons. Management is the least efficient activity of any organization. And if you look at the management lab, they estimate that we waste $3 trillion a year in the U.S. alone on the excess cost of bureaucracy, both indirect and direct costs. We also have massive disengagement of people in organizations, and it's largely due to their managers, supervisors, bosses, and leaders We have massive anxiety throughout society. IBM did a study and they found that most leaders doubt their own ability to manage complexity. So we have people losing sleep, losing their health, massive burdensome costs and disengagement. So we got a serious problem. So what is the solution? Well, management, the definition is planning, organizing, controlling, selecting, coordinating. Those functions need to be done, but it doesn't mean we need a select cohort of managers in a hierarchical org chart to perform those tasks, because we can distribute those tasks throughout an organization and let people manage themselves at work the same way they manage themselves already in their own personal lives. People make gigantic life-altering decisions already without a boss. They decide who to date, who to marry, what to do for a living, where to go to college, whether to buy a house or a car. And yet, the minute they enter the portal of the workplace, they're suddenly too stupid to make decisions without a boss. But they can make decisions without a boss. And if people know what to do at work and how to do it, it begs the question, why do they need a boss at all? People can manage themselves. And I think that's what self-managing organizations around the world are starting to demonstrate, including companies like Haier Group, which is the world's largest appliance manufacturer with 4,000 self-managed teams around the world. So we can manage ourselves without a boss.
Super interesting. Kurt, how does that relate to the way you saw what's in it for you at SRI? You know, what are the benefits of that kind of everybody is their own leader management approach?
I would modulate that a little bit. I think that, I know Doug understands all this stuff, so excuse me for this. I think it's a question of top-down, bottom-up management. And so at SRI, I was the champion of our methodology that got teams together, gave them the skills they needed, made sure we focused on big, important problems and got them done. And what I've discovered, which I agree with Ray about, is that most managers, as opposed to entrepreneurs, if you think about entrepreneurs like Musk or Jobs or any of those people, they understand all this stuff. They know how to put together teams and do the kinds of value creation we're talking about. Most managers have never been trained in that. Most of them have not actually been innovators. And innovation is their number one job. That's the number one job of a CEO. And how many really know how to be an innovator? In my experience, very few. They're great managers, but innovation is a different animal. The second thing I would say is it's about learning. So I've never admonished people. I've never said be a leader, change your culture. You know, I just don't think any of that works. I don't think it's helpful. I think it actually annoys people. I mean, that to me isn't part of the solution. It's not the what. Of course we want people to be leaders and managers and all that kind of stuff. Those are all the whats. It's the how. How do you make those results inevitable? And I would suggest, again, that the key insight that changes everything about your mindset is as soon as you say it's about learning. It's about learning, creating, and improving. That one idea changes everything, because then you say, what are the best ways to learn? Why do barriers get in the way? Why are small teams usually the right way to start? What kind of network do you need? It's all about learning. And my issue is that there are very few senior folks, as Steve was saying, that have been educated. I mean, innovation is not taught in most business schools the way we think about it. It's crazy. It's the number one job. I mean, so, you know, for everybody in the audience here, do you think that your number one job is value creation and innovation? I think that's every professional's number one job. And then again, the question is how. It's not just about the what. We know there's 1,000 books on the what. And we tried them all, by the way, at SRI when we were learning how to get past this disaster we inherited. The what didn't help us. All those books we read didn't help us at all. But that one key insight about doing the experiments and figuring out the how, and the 3 hows, which I look for in every company I go to, are you focusing on big, important customer needs, unmet needs? Do you have a shared language for customer value, what you're supposed to do, and in particular for the value proposition. There are 4 parts of that we ask for. What's the need? What's your approach for the solution? What are the benefits per cost? And what's the competition? Just 4 questions. And again, Ray, those are the 4 questions that no team has ever been able to answer, even though they've worked for years on their initiatives, and they're brilliant people. It's not about the people. It's never about the people. It's that they don't have the right skills and the right processes. Important problems, share the language, and we call them value creation forums. But that's all right. Everybody stood up every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, including me, and we presented our value proposition for 5 minutes max, and we got feedback from the team. That created transparency. It allowed us to put together multidisciplinary teams that allowed continuous learning, because you don't learn this stuff in a workshop. You don't get it from reading a book. You only get it by doing it over and over and over. It's basic learning. And if you don't have that as a manager, if you're not building that into your company going forward for all the reasons Steve writes about, I don't think you can innovate at the speed of today's market. I just don't see it.
Raymond, how would you add to that?
I would add to that in a way that kind of slightly, changes the question. Because frankly speaking, the question, what's in it for me? Why should I manage differently? Is sort of the wrong question. Or actually, maybe that's precisely why we still have so much bad management. Because there's too many people in managerial roles that actually ask, what's in it for me? If we asked, what's the benefit for my organization, for my team, for our customers, even for society at large, if you want. Right? So the question becomes, what contribution can I make? And again, I kind of, quote Drucker, who said that organizations are organs of society, which means that management, has ultimately is responsible for the results those organizations produce, on a wide range. And that comes with huge responsibility. And if you have huge responsibility, you ask, what can I contribute, and not what's in it for me, right? I mean, Doug mentioned some of those, terrible statistics. We all know those, like 85% of employees globally are not engaged, right? 75% of new products and services that come to market, not the ones that are weeded out before, that are actually launched, into the market, are commercially unsuccessful. 70% of change and transformation programs, still fail. And performance of U.S. public companies, has been going down, has been on a steady decline since 1965. I mean, picture it, What a tragedy. I mean, if you put this in other words, our organizations make people miserable, they can't innovate, they can't change, and as a result, performance drops like a rock. Isn't that sad, right? And in that situation, it's not going to help if you ask, what's in it for me, right? But imagine what would be possible if you had, more people in managerial, roles. And I'm very much with Doug on that one. These roles, can be anywhere in the organization where that kind of managerial work gets done. It doesn't have to be at the top. It also has to be at the top if you have some kind of organization like that, but certainly not limited to that. What if all these people, were asking questions like, how do we make work better for everyone in the organization? Imagine how engagement, would skyrocket. How innovation, would thrive. Growth would return to Western economies, and that should be our motivator to manage differently. And yes, to come back to the original question, if you do all that, I'm pretty sure that will bring some personal benefits as well, right? Like satisfaction from doing meaningful work, like being surrounded by people with positive energy, like the thrill of successful product launches, you name it, perhaps even a better career and a higher bonus, I don't know. But those personal benefits are really a result of pursuing higher order goals. It's a bit like shareholder value. You don't maximize shareholder value by maximizing shareholder value. You maximize it by maximizing customer value.
Byproduct. I completely understand. So Steve,
Well said.
Yeah, well said is right.
I don't mind the question, what's in it for me? I think the answer is you get a life. If you're a manager now working in an organization, basically squeezing out earnings for your shareholders and your senior executives, and you're terrorizing your staff to try to make that happen, they don't have a life, you don't have a life. My suggestion would be you need to either change your organization or change your job, get into a line of work where you're actually contributing something to your fellow human being. So I think there's an important question, what's in it for me? It's the whole ball game, your life. That's what's at stake here.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. Yeah.
So let's switch to the next question. I think we've got the philosophies here. I think most of you described the pillars of what's an interesting model. I think people in our audience are probably asking right now, what does this look like when it's working? Describe to me some success. Steve, keep going. Talk a little bit about your places you've seen where this is working or working in pieces. Where do you see the elements of success? What does it feel like?
Oh, when you're there, it feels fantastic. It feels the people, they have a job, they really enjoy it, they're thrilled with what they're doing. And I asked them, if this were to go back to the old way, what would you do? They said, I would leave immediately. I cannot even consider ever working in those kind of conditions ever again. So this is very meaningful to people. And I mean, Kurt has a wonderful success story that I hope that he'll tell that. But we also see cases where someone in the middle of a large organization stands up and says, this is not right. This is not helping our customers. This is not being sensible. What we're currently doing, we have to do something different. And going from there with one team to 3 teams to 25 teams to 400 teams, and suddenly you've got a major corporation that's making $1 trillion in market capitalization. So this is something that begins with somebody somewhere in the organization standing up and say, this is intolerable. This can't continue. It's to end, and I am going to lead the charge.
It's inspiring, Steve. I appreciate that. So, Kurt, Steve just kind of brought the lead in. Talk to us about what it looks like when it's working. What was SRI like when it was effective? Describe some of those characteristics.
When I got there, everybody kind of didn't like each other because when you're failing, you blame everybody else. So it's exactly what Steve said. It's pretty ugly. My first offsite, I stood up and one of the senior managers said, Kurt, you seem to think we're going to grow. We're not going to grow. We can't grow. You can forget that. I mean, imagine saying that to a new CEO. That's what it was like. When I left, we'd grown 3.5 times. We created all these ventures, and we literally, as Ray so nicely just said, it transformed people's lives. And Steve said this too. They realized that the problem was not, these are all PhDs from, Harvard, MIT, Caltech, Stanford. This is not an IQ problem. It was the way they were working problem. And they learned by working together collaboratively on big, important problems that they really could change the world if they had the skills. I want to keep on going back to that. There are very few companies of any type that use any methodology that systematically train their people to do their job, which is value creation. And by the way, as Steve said, that doesn't matter whether you're in the HR department, or the finance department, or the legal department. Your only job is to continuously create new value for your customers. So it's why I now teach, because I saw what this does for people. It changes their lives. It gives them a sense of optimism. And by the way, it's not about the money. It's about doing things that are meaningful in a way with colleagues who are aligned with you. When you create that kind of an environment, magic happens. Think of it. This is an organization with no resources at all that have been failing for 20 years, and all of a sudden it's systematically creating one multi-billion-dollar business after another. That's almost, it seems impossible. I didn't even have money to fire people because I had no money when we started. It was just a question of how do we keep on adding, as Steve also said, find those key champions who want to change, start with them, and start to behave in this new way where, again, you have to train them. So if you don't train them, they don't have a chance. If they don't come from Harvard or Stanford with these skills, they do not. They do not. So you got to start there.
Sorry, go ahead. Is there a specific experience you remember that kind of encapsulates how this works and what a team does different?
Yes. So I once went into, I was always walking around looking at our teams and whether they were doing our methodology. Again, important problems, shared language, stand-up accountability with presenting. I ran into this young woman. She came from a foreign country, and her English was not so great, and she was talking to a Japanese customer. And she was giving what we call big A presentations. She was talking about her approach. This is mostly what we see. That's what everybody does. 99% of the time, people talk about their approach, not the customer value. And I thought she was a really passionate, smart person, so I asked her to go through this process, which she did. 9 months later, she called me up to have a party, and because she just won a multi-million-dollar Department of Energy program, and she just finished her Japanese deal. And she said one of the things she learned was a concept we call bring it to life. And her technology removes CO2 from a chemical process, not the environment, chemical, pure chemical. And she held up a bag, and the bag contained CO2, and it had been removed with the competing technology. And there was this yellow-brown gook in this bag. It looked awful. And then she held up another bag. She said there was CO2 here too, and we removed it with our technology. It looks like there's water in it. She's holding these two bags, and she says, the competing technology is not biodegradable, so it has to go through another process. Ours is not only biodegradable, it can be sold in the secondary market as a fertilizer. So our technology is biodegradable and green and half the cost of the competition. And then she said the most important thing. She said, because I learned these skills, I learned that I could do this, and I did do this. When I brought this to my customer, a Japanese customer, she said, he immediately took it to the vice president, who immediately took it to the CEO, and that's why we succeeded so fast. The same person who'd been failing, and by the way, she thought she was going to be fired because she couldn't do this, who learned these skills and realized then that she can change the world by working in this different, profoundly more productive way.
That's a great story. Find the customer value, make it really obvious, let it go everywhere it needs to go, and success comes to everybody, both the customer and your company. It's great work.
You got to learn these skills, though. You got to know how to do this.
So Doug, I go to you. You have a really interesting contrasting environment. You've got a much more operational experience. Talk a little bit about Morningstar and what it looks like in that kind of more factory-ish kind of place.
Yeah, so Morningstar, one of several success stories out there, but was very heavy industrial, agricultural-based operations. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week during the summer. Every day its trucks go the equivalent of around the world 7 times. Biggest tomato processor in the world, 3 factories. The heart of the company are the technicians, the mechanics, the electricians, the automation specialists, the people that really run the factories. And they are innovators. Many of them have high school or a couple of years of community college, but they are the best in the world at what they do, and they are outright innovators. So we had a mechanic that was wandering around looking for better ways to handle materials, theorized a capital project, found some buy-in, found some budget, create a project that saved millions of dollars. And those opportunities are available to every single person because everyone has the agency and autonomy to lead and innovate as they see opportunities. So that's been cool, and that's what's enabled Morningstar to grow from 0 to become the largest tomato processor in the world. We see no inherent barriers to scale based on organizing around simple principles, like Dee Hock, the founder of Visa, said that simple rules allow for complex, intelligent behavior, and complex rules cause simple, stupid behavior. So we've opted for very simple principles around which people can self-organize, but there are other stories out there. I mentioned Hire Group earlier. Leader of Hire, Jean Ramin, reader of 18th century German philosophers like Immanuel Kant. People have free will. People are the ends, not the means to an end. And to the degree that we believe that, we will start to clean up our language. Kurt alluded to the need for shared language, and much of the language we use in organizations is quite dehumanizing, starting with human resources. People aren't resources, they're human beings. We talk about man hours as if women don't exist, and head count as if people don't have bodies. So we need to elevate our language if we want to make significant lasting change, because language is the currency of culture. I'd point to another great example in Jaipur, India. Nand Kishore Chowdhury founded Jaipur Rugs, hand-knotted rugs sold in luxury markets around the world, woven by 40,000 members of the untouchable class in villages throughout India. He has changed lives across India by cutting out the middleman and giving the carpet weavers autonomy, agency, and self-organization. And these people are elevating the lives of their families, their villages, changing lives across India based on simple principles of human agency. So we need to be story wranglers and story curators and start sharing these stories widely. We want to inspire people to change.
Compelling. It can be done anywhere. I think that's a fantastic message in here. Raymond, describe a couple of your experiences with clients and how that's worked.
Well, first of all, I'd like to agree that obviously, you know it when you see it. In a sense, that's what Kurt alluded to, and also Doug to some extent. When you're in there, you know it. But obviously, I like to sort of, based on, you might guess by now from our previous dates, I like to kind of go under the hood and say, well, what makes that happen? What makes that magic happen? And first of all, I would like to say that it actually does look different in different contexts. It depends on industry, your culture, your business model, all sorts of differences. Management at the end of the day, I'm convinced is a contextual activity. So that's also, by the way, why there cannot be any simple 7-step recipes or things like that. So, throw away all those books you have in your bookshelf that try to promise you, recipes you can follow or copy. There's many different ways, and they have to fit the particular context that you're in. But of course, I would say that some of the successful examples actually share, some common traits. The first I would say is they rely on a set of carefully crafted, very detailed practices and processes that reflect some deliberate choices of people who have actually thought about how work works. It don't have to be rocket science, and I think Doug is precisely right there. In fact, when they work well, they're actually often extremely simple, but they're well thought through. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that those practices and processes tend to reinforce one another. Okay, so that typically if you were to take out one of those practices and put it into a different organization, it wouldn't work there because it's lacking some of the other fabric that's required, to get us to kind of, create that type of magic. And finally, they all represent kind of a holistic and coherent, again, what I would call management model, because they all rely on a common set of principles and assumptions that drive all those choices about how you organize work. So maybe one example that many people are actually familiar with is Ritz-Carlton. They're known for exceptional customer service that's very, very consistent, yet highly personalized. The question is, well, how do they do that? Okay. And of course, I could go on for hours to explain the whole story, but here's just a little sneak peek into maybe some of that makes that magic happen. The first is they have very specifically spelled out what they call service values. So they define what great service actually looks like. They don't just, talk in the abstract about we want to be the best and blah, 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 but they actually are very specific what service actually looks like, what great service looks like. Next, they put those service values on what they call credo cards. And credo cards are literally part of, team members' uniforms. They carry them with them every day, whether you're working in front desk, the concierge, whether you're in housekeeping, you carry those credo cards with you. That's practice number one. Practice number two, they do daily lineup meetings at every single Ritz-Carlton hotel at every single day, where the whole staff, that starts to shift from all different departments actually comes together. And they pull out one of those credo cards, and then they share stories for 10 or 15 minutes about how they brought this particular service value to life in the past week with particular guests. So they share real stories. That keeps those values present and also makes them come alive, right? It's very different to companies, putting values on the walls of their meeting rooms and stuff like that. But that's again, storytelling that brings things to life, in human stories. And one of those values, as an example, says, as a team member, I own and immediately resolve guest problems. Okay. Now that's easy to say, but maybe hard to do unless you have another practice that they put in place. And now listen to this. It's absolutely fantastic that every single team member gets a budget of $2,000 per guest per day that they can spend on their own initiative to resolve some of those guest problems. No questions asked. They don't need to go ask a supervisor for permission. They just can do it, right? So that's a kind of an example of very specific, in a sense, simple, but reinforcing practices that can explain, some of the magic that many of us, who have stayed at the Ritz-Carlton, actually have experienced. And there's many, many more like that. Not sure how we're doing on time. If we can go into a different, another example, but
we're doing perfect. But here's where we are. So I'm going to first tell the audience that in 5 minutes we're going to take some questions. So please start thinking about those and post those in the main room. Thank you very much, and we'll have somebody feed those to us, and we'll have about 10 minutes to answer them. But I just wanted to let the group sort of one last comment here. As people in the audience go back to work at the end of this week or the beginning of next, what's the first few steps? How do I get going? What can I change for myself or my team or my company that would make a difference? And so, Raymond, just keep going. What would you say they should go back and do first?
Well, obviously, and I think you would guess it by now, they should get their team together and actually do a little management model mapping exercise together. And really, no matter where you are in the organization, you can do this at every level in the organization. You don't have to be the CEO, and you don't have to ask anyone's permission. So get your team together and begin to map out how you experience, management working around you right now. So put down those practices, those processes that kind of, heavily influence your team's activities, whatever they may be, whether you're customer facing, whether you're support staff, whether you're back office. Map out those practices and processes, and to the best of your knowledge, try also to figure out, why they are the way they are. That means go beneath that level and try to figure out what are the principles, what are the theories, the worldviews, if you will. Try and map that out, okay? You can do this simply on a flip chart, whatever. If you don't know where to start, you can go to managementmodeldesign.net and you find a little sort of, tool set and some guiding questions that may help you get started at least. But just map that out. And then as a team, look at that management landscape that you see and try to figure out, well, where are some of the obstacles? What are the things that get in our way that prevent us from doing our best possible? Okay? And then just be creative and think of ways how you can remove those obstacles or at least make them irrelevant. And just try that for a few weeks. Design a little experiment and just without asking anyone for permission, just as a team, decide to work differently, for a few weeks and see whether that produces better results. Once you have those results, repeat and remove the next obstacle. Then use those results to win allies and start a movement in your organization, until you literally take over the organization. I mean, this may sound, terribly simplistic, but we have to start somewhere. And remember, it's very easy, for someone higher up the ladder to say no to one person or to one team. But it's very, very difficult to say no to a movement that you already have going in the organization. So do your experiments, start to work differently with what you can influence and start a movement. Really take
Great first step, Raymond. That's a really, you're right, straightforward thing to go back and do. Kurt, add to that. I see you commenting here in our own chat channel. What else would you add to Kurt to Ray's recommendations? Sorry, Kurt.
I was gone for a second. So I would build on what Ray said. When we started this, my senior manager actually didn't approve it. I didn't have to. We just got our team together and we said we had to learn how to become value creators. And we only had a few principles. The first one was it's about creating value for our customers. And we have to create significant value for our customers. And the other was this big idea. I think this is a big idea. The big idea is it's about learning. And as soon as you say that, then you go through and you say, what are the best learning techniques? We need a simple framework. So as Ray said, we can communicate and develop the language of customer value. And bit by bit, we basically took over the company. That's what happened is with no permission from anybody. And it's not about the money. And just to tell you, we met my team, because I used to work for RCA, and big companies don't teach you this stuff. So he became part of SRI. What my team agreed to do was to meet from 5 until 9 o'clock every other Monday night over pizza and Coke. Everybody would stand up, including me, give a 2-minute talk on what you were doing, share something you've learned, and bit by bit, we began to understand these principles and came up with some simple frameworks that basically then took over the company. You don't need money, you don't need permission, you don't need anything. All you need to do is learn a few things and base it on developing customer value, and you can do this, and you can change your life.
So, gentlemen, thank you so much. I've been getting feedback over LinkedIn and Twitter that these have been great discussions. We got a couple of questions from the audience, so I'd like to share these questions with you. So the first question comes from Inga Lil Holmquist. What are the 3 most important things to be present in the organization to enable management by everyone?
I'm going to start with Doug. Maybe let him take that question. Doug, if you want to repeat the question again, please, and let Doug, he can take a swing at it.
What are the 3 most important things to be present in the organization to enable management by everyone?
Okay, so I would say the first thing that needs to be present is the existence of simple, clear principles. Much easier to enable management by everyone when they can organize around very simple, clear, transparent principles that are understandable by everyone. And so that's what we try to do at Morningstar. We had 2 principles. Don't use force against other people and keep commitments. And the first principle meant that there is 0 command authority, which means that everything is accomplished by request and response. The second principle is we do what we say we're going to do. And if you align with those principles, it would be kind of an amazing world indeed. But simple, clear principles. Secondly, we need people to take initiative and identify their value and how they create value for customers. Julian Birkinshaw did a study of knowledge workers. They found that 41% of the time of knowledge workers was spent on activities that were unimportant, that they didn't want to do and could be better done by other people. So if we can help people identify their higher value activities and lower value activities and self-manage toward optimizing the higher value activities, we can create more value for customers at the individual level. So I think that's the second important thing. And then the third important thing is to allow people to have agency and autonomy and freedom so that they are free to build relationships and acquire resources and do their best work. And we are all free-willed individuals. We know that from philosophy and history. And so let's acknowledge the humanity of that and give people that option.
Excellent answer, Doug. Thank you. Can we take another question then?
Okay, the second question comes from Leonardo Zamarola. I hope I pronounced his name right. Do you see any change in our current management model if we take open source into account? How to encourage open source and insert it into our daily activities?
Who's got a software background and wants to answer that question? How do those 2 tie together? Raymond, Kurt, Steve?
I would say I participated in a number of open source conferences over the last couple of years. And what I've seen is that when open source innovation takes place in what I call 20th century management, nothing happens. You go to interesting meetings, you get interesting ideas, they die on the vine. The only time it happens is if the organization is practicing 21st century management, where it's focused on adding value to the customer, where staff are enabled to make their contribution and the organization is run as a network. Then open innovation is a perfect fit. So it comes back to the theme that I was outlining in my talk earlier, that unless and until we make that transition to 21st century management, all of these fancy ideas are basically spinning wheels. they don't work.
Thank you, Steve. Perfect. Let's take a third question.
Okay, this next question comes from the Heart of the World Agility Forum in Lisbon. And we heard earlier that agility, the way we talk about it today, it got its name from the work of software developers. Okay, they created the Agile Manifesto, and now everybody wants to be agile. We also noticed that the leaders of these top organizations, they'll have a background in software development. You know, people like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg. So we see this link between development and software development and the modern companies. Now, during our talk, we heard a lot about the individual managers and what they're doing right or what they're doing wrong, but we didn't hear much about systems. So like these developers, they created things like Scrum and Kanban and extreme programming, to basically manage complexity. So how do you think management, which seems to be more about individuals and maybe creating a machine underneath them to produce money, but how do you see management and leadership adopting frameworks or constraints or something in order to be able to meet the challenges moving forward?
Raymond, how do you approach that idea? How do frameworks help? How do they not? What do you use and when do you use it?
Well, I think that's precisely what we're doing to some extent, at least if I understand the question correctly, what we're trying to achieve, with management model design, which is basically where you are becoming to be very specific and deliberate and intentional about, shaping and designing that very system that you put in place that then at the end of the day really powers the organization. I'm really skeptical when it comes to off-the-shelf frameworks. As I think I said, I believe management is a contextual activity. You have to think things through really, for yourself in your particular context. You can be inspired by particular frameworks, but I don't think you can just take a framework off the shelf and say, okay, this is how we're going to operate, our organization. Because again, as Steve so nicely pointed out as well, in his keynote and much of his writing, organizations are not machines that you can just put into some sort of a particular framework. They are systems, that we can influence, in terms of how they work. But again, that requires thinking things through and being explicit and deliberate about why we do things the way we do things. That's about as much as I can say.
Comment to that, Mike?
Sure, Kurt, go ahead.
Well, I want to tie these together because frameworks are essential. Whether you say they're a concept or a principle, they're frameworks that are fundamental to value creation. But I think one solid thing we can all agree upon is if they're not fundamental, they don't help. They've got to be complete and fundamental. If they're too complicated, they also don't work. And so many of the recipes that people promote, you can't remember them. You can't use them. And I actually, in our experience, we find that the complicated things where there are 13 questions you've got to answer and they all interact with each other, they actually do damage to the organization because people can't use them. They can't remember them, can't think about them. So it'd be interesting to have a session just on what would we agree as a team would be fundamental principles. I think Doug did a great job of describing some of them that really help.
Great answers, guys. Let's take one more.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. This one comes from Chet Hendrickson, panelist from this morning, or from earlier today. What is the role of storytelling in transforming an organization?
Well, I used it in the World Bank. Nothing else worked. Why storytelling? Nothing else works. So that's a short answer to that question.
It's how people remember things.
Good answer. There's no way around it. If you can't tell a story, it's hard to get people to buy in. All right, everybody. I thank you very much. This has been a really interesting panel. You guys have had a fantastic conversation. Thanks for all the questions. If there's more, we'd happily take those offline and see if we can't get some answers back later in the program. But I thank you all for your attention in the audience. I thank the panelists for a really dynamic discussion. Enjoyed being the facilitator today and look forward to the next time.